big theme of what we're talking about on today's show is pretty simple. This system, the system of profits for big corporations, works on one principle: it will kill people to pocket money for CEOs and billionaires. And when I say kill people, that's not a figure of speech or an exaggeration. Welcome to the show. This is Jonathan Tassini, and this is the show for July 1st, 2020. As usual, just to remind people, our major sponsor is the American Postal Workers Union, which fights for dignity, respect, and good wages for its 200,000 members and retirees, as well as 2,000 private sector workers. Now, you too can become one of our supporters, and we have two ways of doing that. You can go over to workinglife.org, click on the podcast tab, and find your way over to Patreon, and you can make a contribution there, either one time or become a regular sponsor. Or if you're more comfortable because you're familiar with it, you can do the same thing at ActBlue. We've partnered up with ActBlue to try to raise funds to support this network as we continue bringing you this information I think you're not going to find anywhere else. Now, we have big companies today in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic who don't give a second thought to making profits, even if that means thousands of workers and their families will get sick and die of the virus. And I've been covering this over many, many months since the pandemic erupted. And actually, it's a feature, not a bug, no pun intended. In food processing, all those workers who make sure you get your beef or chicken onto your plate are getting sick by the droves, and they're dying. And the only way that happens is because companies, big rich companies, keep dangerous plants operating, because to make things differently, to make them safer, would cost them a few bucks. Now, that's criminal in a normal world. And then even before the pandemic, big corporations were making money killing people using your tax dollars. I'm talking about the big defense contractors who, even when they break the law and are caught in fraud scams and bribery, just keep the war machine humming to the tune of, check this out, $732 billion in 2019. And that's more than the next countries combined spending on so-called defense. And actually, those two ideas are connected. The fact that workers are dying on their jobs in this pandemic, and that the defense industry is essentially responsible for killing thousands of people across the globe. When profit is the goal, not the welfare of people, companies will make huge profits off the illness and death of workers, or, as I said, the killing of people around the world, rather than, for example, making sure that we have a world-class medical system that stops a virus from turning into a pandemic and also treats people who might get sick for a small amount of money. See, a virus is a microscopic threat, but it becomes an existential threat, a threat to life itself, when people in power use their positions to get rich. Now, since the pandemic erupted, as I just said, I've spent a lot of time on many episodes talking about the threats, the safety and health threats to frontline workers. And it's only getting worse. And it will get worse as the virus now is surging across the country and people are forced to go back to work. So let's get into that deeper with a regular guest on the show, Debbie Berkowitz. Debbie is the director of the Worker Health and Safety Program at the National Employment Law Project, and she is one of the nation's great experts and great advocates for worker safety and health. And Debbie, before we dig into the specific thing that I wanted to talk about, which is the poultry industry, because this was the substance in many ways of the alert that you've been sending out and the urging that you're trying to get OSHA to actually act to protect people, I wanted to give my audience a couple of real senses of what's going on out there among workers. And I've done a ton of segments since the pandemic started individually about frontline workers, various types of workers over the course of, yes, the last 3 months. But I think giving people a big picture will, I think, underscore the enormity of the crisis we're facing. And so I want to read a couple of statistics that you sent out in your alert and some of the things you footnoted. We know about the frontline workers in the healthcare industry that 60,000 of them have now been confirmed with COVID-19 and hundreds have died. And those are the people that every day people stand out on their porches or wherever they are on their lawns and ring bells for. But and those are great people. Let's not underestimate that. But on top of that, you've got lots of frontline workers, which I think often get a little bit obscured by the healthcare workers. And I don't say that in a negative way. I just think we are so grateful to those people who are taking care of people in hospitals. But you've got, for example, the frontline workers that feed us in meatpacking and food processing plants. And you footnoted some data from the Food and Environment Reporting Network that at least 37,000 plus workers, that's in meatpacking, food processing, and farm workers, have tested positive for COVID-19, and at least 127 of them have died. And I want to underscore that every time we say at least, and you'll talk about this as well, sometimes we just don't know.
Right.
And especially for low wage workers and people of color, low wage workers of color who end up basically going home and they're often not tracked. They may die of COVID-19, but they're not part of the statistic. And then you've got 100 or so transit workers who have died taking people, moving people from place to place, especially in New York City. You've got the harvest coming where you've got thousands of farm workers, the summer harvest, flooding into places like Florida and Oregon. They're going to be exposed to COVID-19. So the first overall question I want to ask you is this. In your experience, and you've been at this for so many years, have you ever seen the scale of workplace illness and death in such a short period of time, really because of one factor?
Now, this is an unprecedented emergency, which just further sort of underscores the total failure of this administration to step up and, uh, enforce the OSHA law and protect workers. Usually in the meatpacking industry, I don't know, maybe you have a dozen workers get killed a year, maybe a little bit more. You've had over 100 that we know of have died from COVID-19. Um, the meat, I think you could say about 20% of plants, 50% of other plants um, are getting COVID-19 in meat and poultry, which is on top of the normal regular injuries and illnesses they get in terms of amputations and cuts. So this is just unprecedented in the scope and the way it's affecting not just meat and poultry and of course healthcare, as you said, but bus drivers and occupations that normally you don't think of as so hazardous, and grocery store workers and warehouse workers and um, all the workers that have been working so far. And now, we're getting a lot of letters, a lot of emails from restaurant workers who are terrified about indoor dining and having to work in a workplace where nobody's wearing a mask but them.
And you, I assume, your daily life now, every single hour, you are literally trying to save workers' lives and make sure they don't get sick. And you must be really deeply concerned about this recent surge now that we're seeing sweeping across the nation. I just saw this morning Dr. Anthony Fauci predict that we may have, if we don't start acting in a more responsible way, and I don't mean just individually, but as a government handling this, we may have 100,000 cases per day, which of course, a huge percentage of those, to your point about restaurants and bars, a huge percentage of those cases are happening in the workplace.
Right. It's really, I don't know what else to say, but it's reckless, it's irresponsible to not think about what it means for the individual workers who work there, as well as the customers, and to sort of reopen, because the key to a healthy economy is to beat COVID-19, not to open and sicken 100,000, people immediately. And I think, what's really stunning for me and striking, and maybe, call me naive, but at the beginning of the pandemic, like in the middle of March, when I would get calls from nurses or meatpacking workers that it's spreading, and I would say, just call OSHA. OSHA's
Yeah.
going to come out immediately. They don't have a standard yet, but they're going to cite the company because we know it's 6 feet apart, it's masks, it's the proper equipment in healthcare, it's triaging patients. And OSHA just simply, when they called, said, "We're not doing inspections. We're not sure it's our jurisdiction," one of OSHA inspectors said, and wrongly, but um, there's nothing we can do. And that came right from the top. That came right from the president. It came from Eugene Scalia. That is what they were told to do. And they completely failed. And so now it's really up to the state governors, and some are doing it right, and some seem to just have politics guiding them.
And I want to underscore for people when Debbie mentioned Eugene Scalia, that name should ring a bell. He is the son of the departed Supreme Court Justice Anthony Scalia. So one understands where they come from, at least on the political wing and the ideology of how to address and take care of workers. And so on OSHA, before we talk about the poultry industry, which to me is shocking what's going on there, I want to ask you one question about whether you can separate or take into account the fact that you and I have talked about OSHA for a very long time over the last several years. Is it the fact that OSHA has always been really rickety and not staffed enough from what it really needs to be? Or is there a level of outrageous behavior that's happened now under this administration that takes it to a new level? Or is it really the actual fundamental, really understaffing of OSHA that's been true for really decades?
This is a level of outrage that's never existed before, that even with depleted resources, OSHA can do more. In 2009, when Obama became president, and Jordan Barrer became Deputy Assistant Secretary, and I became the Chief of Staff, we were notified that there were a lot of construction deaths in Texas. And then OSHA was pretty understaffed, after sort of 8 years of the Bush administration. And we just took inspectors from all over the country and sent them into Texas to do a sweep of the state, to send a very clear message that OSHA was on the beat, that they're here, and that employers have to provide a safe workplace. OSHA has never in its history not gone after bad actor industries. Ronald Reagan and George Bush gave out the first George Bush, some of the highest fines against meatpacking companies. I mean, the fact that the entire healthcare industry, the entire nursing home industry was given a pass, not to have to protect workers and provide safe conditions. And on top of that, you're right, though, Jonathan, and that is that the Trump administration is really trying to, get OSHA to disappear. And so it now has the least number of inspectors it has in the history of the agency.
Okay, so now let's go to the topic that we wanted to focus on. And I know your time is short, so I wanted to dig right into it. Some weeks ago, I had on the show Stuart Applebaum, who you know quite well, the president of the Retail, Wholesale, and Department Store Union. And he was talking about the absolute fear and panic and crisis that was going on in the poultry plants of workers that the union represents in the South, particularly. And it was just astounding what was happening to folks. And of course, you know as well as I know that part of the problem in a poultry plant is that, first of all, the speed of the line is quite fast. And also, people talk about social distancing. People actually, when we use the metaphor, working shoulder to shoulder, they literally are shoulder to shoulder. And yet, what the Trumpsters want to do is actually make it worse now. So explain what's going on, which to me was, I guess, like you, maybe I'm naive, but it really blew my mind. It was so unfathomable.
Before I even begin, I just want to say that this really highlights the incredible health disparity that's going on with COVID-19, what's happening in the poultry industry, and that is Black and brown workers are in many industries, they are disproportionately represented in many of the frontline industries. Um, from nursing home workers to meatpacking and poultry workers, and they're bearing the brunt of COVID-19. And as we know, not only are they out there with greater exposures because they're the essential workers, but also when they get COVID-19, they have more serious complications. And that's why poultry and meatpacking workers are terrified. And uh, the industry really just ignored the CDC guidance for a very long time. And only after the union really, and I have to give Stuart Applebaum, the head of RWDSU, and the UFCW, the parent union, a lot of credit for coming out with press releases and saying workers are dying, workers are getting sick and nothing's being done. And once those press releases came out, the media started covering it, and it really was the kids of meatpacking workers, because workers are so scared
Mm,
to say anything. It's just like a climate of fear that they live in, even in the union plants, um, to raise these issues in the media and the industry. I mean, we all knew by then, by like the second week of March, we all knew about 6 feet apart, right? And a week later, we were told masks so that we, if we're infected, wouldn't spread it to other people, and stepped up being able to wash your hands repeatedly. And meatpacking plants continued to keep workers shoulder to shoulder on the line for 8 or 10 hours a day, incentivize sick workers to come to work because you didn't get your bonus
mm.
unless you worked every single day during the month of April. And if you were sick from COVID, you didn't get your bonus. So it incentivized them to come to work when we know once you're sick, you really need to quarantine. But they wanted people to come to work sick because they're interested in their bottom line and their profits. And the meat industry is actually making money now with so many workers. I think it's 30,000, as you said, meat and poultry workers sick. And that's an underestimate because some states aren't reporting any data by industry,
Mm.
like Nebraska. So the cases are much more. And we know of about 100, 120 that have died so far. And you know what, Jonathan? Meat workers are still working shoulder to shoulder. The companies put these plastic barriers between them. Like that has some magic potential to protect them, but there's no evidence, not it doesn't work at all. That you have to separate workers 6 feet apart and then put the plastic barriers. You can't have workers working shoulder to shoulder and having plastic barriers on the side, but there are thousands of workers in these plants. And also, we worry that it's going to impede ventilation, which is really important in getting the virus out of the workplace. And, the meat industry is spending a lot of money. The poultry industry, Tyson, JBS, Pilgrim's Pride, Purdue, Smithfield, National Beef, Cargill, they're spending a lot of money on public relations and saying they're doing everything they can. And, I hope consumers are not fooled. They can do a lot more. They can really protect workers. And instead, they apply to increase their line speeds and keep workers working closer together so they can produce more and increase profits. And some of the things that was sort of stunning to me to find out about the meat and poultry industry. I know there was one pork plant in Waterloo, Iowa, where 1,000 of 2,800 workers were sick and many workers died, and they overwhelmed the hospital system there. And most of that pork, if not all of it, went to China.
Hmm.
So it wasn't about feeding America. It was really just about company profits. And I don't really understand. This administration is the first ever since the creation of OSHA that has not gone after a bad actor industry. And instead, OSHA and the president and the secretary of labor are aiding and abetting uh, these unsafe practices that are sickening tens of thousands and are killing meatpacking workers.
Well, I'm shocked, shocked, shocked that these companies would choose profits over the lives and the safety of workers. That's never happened in history, right? As you can tell from my dripping sarcasm. But and I want to just zero on this one thing. Tell us about the waivers that these poultry companies are getting to increase the line speed at this point.
So under the Obama administration, they issued a new rule on how poultry would be inspected. And at that point, the meat industry, even USDA, which is a government agency that is the meat industry, it's very few industries have their own representative in the government, but that is the meat industry. And they wanted to be able to increase their line speeds because they would make more money and more profit. And the Obama administration said, no, it's not safe for consumers and it's not safe for workers. But under the Trump administration, they decided that they would allow companies to waive the requirements of the rule that was passed in 2014 and increase their line speeds, which means that workers would have to work harder and faster to produce more chickens to increase the company's profits. And 15 waivers were issued in the middle of the pandemic
This is
to
amazing.
Tyson, to Mount Air, to George's, and I'm forgetting the fourth company, all of which had poor safety records. They either had COVID-19 outbreaks or they had records of amputations in the plant or OSHA violations. But for the companies to want to increase line speeds and the government to increase production was In fact, CDC said one of the things that they should do is slow the lines down to spread workers farther apart. So instead of having, you know, like 10 workers on a line, now you're going to have six. I mean, most lines have hundreds and hundreds. So you just would have less workers and maybe add another shift. But that way, workers can separate 6 feet apart and build new break rooms outside. You know, they're all crowded into break rooms and locker rooms. I mean, the industry really has to retool. And these are billion-dollar companies. These are not small and mom and pop shops that are going to that need government help to do this. It is their responsibility to protect workers, but they have a very good PR effort. And consumers, in the end, consumers, it's really up to you all about check where your chicken's coming from and decide whether you really want to support these companies.
That's a great ending, and really thank you for, first of all, for your work. You're really one of the most important advocates for workers' safety and health out there, and especially now, but always. And thank you for being on the show as usual.
Thank you, Jonathan, for having me.
A few days ago, Bernie Sanders introduced a bill to cut the defense budget by 10%, which is really a very, very modest proposal. If you look at the bloated Pentagon and the immoral waste of so much money at a time of human needs, and actually, it's been a waste of money going back decades if you think about what that money could be used for education, healthcare, transportation, everything that a society needs. And I just said, as just a moment ago, that the killing of workers at their jobs and the killing of human beings around the globe are done fundamentally in the service of making more profits for big corporations. So it's very relevant at any time to talk about taking a cleaver to the Pentagon budget. To help us think about this, it's a pleasure to have on the show Ashik Siddique, who is a research analyst with the National Priorities Project, which has for many years focused on making the federal budget understandable to the average person. And Ashik, I thought we would address the whole question of military spending for two reasons. One is there's a lot of conversation right now, as you know, out in the country about stimulus in this moment of crisis. And in fact, the Democrats put forth, as you well know, in the House, a $3 trillion stimulus bill, which I have already said in previous programs. I'm going to talk about it again, is too little. It's not enough. And the second thing that happened in the last few days, as you quite well know, is that Bernie Sanders, along with a few co sponsors and Barbara Lee in the House, introduced a bill to cut military spending, the Pentagon spending, by 10%. And it's in the context of the debate over what's called the National Defense Authorization Act. And again, this is for my audience. You're the expert. You know all this. And the design of this was to get $74 billion, and I'm now quoting from Bernie's press release, to create a federal grant program to fund healthcare, housing, childcare, and educational opportunities for cities and towns experiencing a poverty rate of 25% or more. And I just want to quote two or three more things from his prepared text just to give us something to kind of react to. Number one, and now I'm quoting, year after year, Democrats and Republicans who disagree on almost everything come together with minimal debate to support an exploding Pentagon budget, which is now higher than the next 11 nations combined and represents more than half of our discretionary spending. And that's the end of that quote. And then he goes on to talk about the role of the defense contractors in this whole, what I would call, scam. And now I'm quoting again. Since 1995, Boeing, Lockheed Martin, and United Technologies have paid over $3 billion in fines or related settlements for fraud or misconduct. Yet those three companies received around $1 trillion in defense contracts over the past 2 decades alone. And then he quoted Martin Luther King in a famous quote that I think many people know about. And I'm quoting again, in 1967, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. warned us that, and he's quoting now Dr. King, a nation that continues year after year to spend more money on military defense than on programs of social uplift is approaching spiritual death. So, in that context, I wanted to ask you what your reaction is to this attempt to cut the budget, both in terms of the 10%, is it enough, and what your other thoughts are.
Yeah, thanks so much for that introduction. I mean, that MLK quote is a really perfect way to frame it because it shows that he said that in, I think, 1967. That's over 40 years ago at this point. So this is not a new priority, cutting the military budget and shifting priorities, like reinvesting in other social forms of spending. That's not new. People have been saying that for many, many decades, that the US is spending too much on its military compared to housing and healthcare and all sorts of other things that are going unmet in times of need, which has really always been the case, and it's more stark than ever in the time of coronavirus. And I think the number of unemployed people right now is approaching half. I haven't seen the most recent count, but it's really alarming. Over 40 million people lost jobs in the first 2 months after the crisis began. So there are just so many other things right now that the government could be spending on, but this military budget just keeps growing and growing. So this 10% cut is really something that is extremely reasonable. This is a reasonable, modest cut, as Bernie Sanders said, that no one should say no, no matter who you are, if you're conservative or liberal or on the left or right. There's so much waste and problematic spending in the Pentagon budget that everybody should be able to say yes to a 10% cut. Just to put it in context, that would only take us back to the Obama years. Like in the past 3 years alone, under the Trump administration, I think the Pentagon budget has grown by over $100 billion to the point where now they're talking about increasing it to 740 billion in the next, which is the number that they're proposing a 10% cut from. So there's really no justification for this continued increase. There's so many places in the budget that Senator Sanders and Markey and others who have signed on to this bill have pointed to as places that could be cut. They don't specify, I don't think they exactly specify where that 10% would come from, but there are lots and lots of places that you could point to, at just starting with bloated and overhead.
Mm. And so let's dwell on a couple of points that you just raised here. The first thing is, and it's reflecting what Bernie Sanders said, this is the fault of Republicans and Democrats over many years. Your point that this cut would only bring us back to what Obama had basically proposed and gotten passed during his presidency. It shows the level at which there has been basically unanimity and pretty much a bipartisan consensus to keep shoving tons of money at the Pentagon. This goes back decades.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's been on and off for many decades, like since World War II, which I think was, if you adjust for inflation, was sort of an all-time high in terms of military spending as a proportion of national spending. But the amount of spending that we have now, I think you may have quoted it, but it's already higher than the military spent at the height of the Cold War or during the wars in Vietnam and Korea. I think the only years when it was higher were at the peak of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars during, I believe, the Bush years. So this is the highest amount of military spending we've had at almost any point since World War II. And if we think about, the narratives that are told about how military spending is justified, World War II is always the example in terms of, the national story that politicians tell about America. That was the good war. We were fighting, fascism itself. But since then, the narrative just becomes more and more vague and diffuse. During the Cold War, there was this great other geopolitical power, the Soviet Union, that we were supposedly competing against, that justified all the spending. But we don't even really have that anymore. There's been a real attempt, an ongoing attempt that's actually escalating now, to present China and Russia as great powers that we're competing with. But even then, the US spends more than the next 10 countries combined. And if we cut the entire military budget in half, it would still be bigger than China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea combined. So, yeah, and most of the other major military spenders are US allies in Europe or Japan or other countries where there's no conceivable threat from them.
And
So,
clearly, what's driving this and has been driving this for a long time, as I quoted from Bernie's prepared text, is the defense contractors. I mean, they are making money hand over fist, and it's the real profit motivation that's driving it. I don't care about all the great flag waving and all the great calls to national defense and national security. What's driving it at the corporate level, as is the case at in so many cases and so many instances, is the drive for profits, right?
exactly. Of that $740 billion budget, about half of it goes to military contractors. So companies like Northrop Grumman, Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, Boeing, they're just raking in profits, and there's really very little accountability on how that money is spent. There are all sorts of cost overruns that constantly happen. There are all sorts of settlements and fines that have been levied over the past few years for fraud and misconduct. And usually the settlements are much stronger than any actual transgression that they're found to have committed. Uh, and the very same defense contractors that have been found guilty or reached settlements for fraud are also paying their CEOs really excessive compensation packages. Like if you look at any measure, like comparing the CEO pay to their average worker pay, it's just a huge disparity. So a lot of these federal funds for defense contractors, which make up half of the military budget, they're going straight to the top.
And I'm now digging into my gray cells. I used to read about this more carefully some years ago, all this defense budget stuff. So you'll correct me if I'm totally off about this. But as I remember it, these defense contractors, it's almost a no lose business, meaning they basically jerk up the prices, they over charge. And so when you get a contract for a big weapon system, say a fighter or an aircraft carrier or a nuclear submarine, you can't lose. You're going to make money.
Exactly. There are just not very many examples of Congress or the president ever using their powers of oversight to hold contractors accountable for when they do things wrong. Like one of the most famous examples is the F-35, this fighter jet that's cost many tens of billions already by some measures. Yeah, just approaching really astronomical costs over decades, and all sorts of issues where they just don't work properly at all. Like there are all sorts of crazy accidents, and like launching seats catching on fire. Just it doesn't make any sense. Like even the stated rationale for why these jets are necessary are in the context of some kind of hot war with another nation, which we shouldn't ever get to if we're actually promoting peace and trying to do diplomacy. Like the bigger military budget is, and the more it's driven up by these the profit motives of these companies, the more likely it is that we're going to use these weapons rather than investing more in diplomacy and actual attempts at peace and cooperation. So the more we spend on these weapon systems for the profits of companies, the more likely we are to get into some escalation that is going to just cost lives for no reason.
And it's quite interesting, I'm sure, for you when you watch the debates on these budgets to hear that these things pass almost without objection. As I pointed out from Bernie's statement, it's something that Democrats and Republicans totally unite about, just throwing money at the Pentagon. Whereas by contrast, when we're talking about building schools or giving workers $600 a month or $1,200 a month in the worst economic crisis in our memory, in our lifetimes, all of a sudden there's all those deficit hawks and those people wringing their hands about spending too much money. This must strike you as quite hypocritical.
Yeah, absolutely. It's only ever when we're talking about spending on things that would actually benefit people and meet real human needs that we start getting asked questions about how we pay for it. But that's never asked about tax cuts for the wealthy, and it's never asked about raising the military budget. We're what I think just barely 2 months past this enormous uh, economic package that was passed supposedly as a a means to boost the economy after the coronavirus crisis, but most of that was handouts to corporations. Most people just got one check for $1,200 when they're losing their jobs and struggling to pay rent and meet basic needs. So there's $2 trillion that can just be created out of thin air to basically bail out corporations that are suffering, but not for the people. And meanwhile, we're talking about raising the military budget during the greatest economic crisis since the Depression. So it really just makes no sense, and it just exposes what's really behind all this.
And it highlights the difference between two views and two versions of what national defense means for you and I, and for I think many people, many progressives. We think of national defense as making sure that everybody has a job, that everybody can have health care that doesn't send them into bankruptcy, that schools aren't crumbling, that people can get actual real unemployment insurance when, God forbid, they lose their job, mostly because of corporate decisions, versus a view of national defense that's about giving the Pentagon a ton of money to conduct all these wars that essentially kill people and do nothing to strengthen the nation.
That's absolutely right. And also, we often hear about the need to support the troops, right? Like we're funding the military so much because we're supporting the troops who are bravely putting themselves in harm's way to keep us all safe. But if you look at where the money is going in the Pentagon budget, half of it is going to these defense contractor companies. Only a fifth goes to the troops themselves in terms of their salaries and benefits. So this 10% cut being presented now in an amendment is careful to emphasize that support for the troops, their benefits and salaries are not going to be part of that, but they're going to focus on all these forms of waste and fraud and corruption, which is where there is a lot of potential to get conservative support as well. I think plenty of people who tend to vote Republican aren't aware that these are the actual dynamics behind the Pentagon budget, and when they find out, they tend to be upset. There are plenty of conservatives and more libertarian leaning Republicans who have co-signed a lot of these types of amendments and resolutions that Sanders and other progressives have presented.
My favorite slogan from back during the Iraq War is support the troops, bring them home alive. That was the thing that we used to respond to. And to your point, I remember that a few years ago, Rand Paul and Barney Frank united together on an attempt to cut the Pentagon budget quite significantly for the reasons that you just said. So if I gave you the magic wand and I gave you all the power to say this is what we should do, because frankly 10% is just really a very modest cut, what would you do? How deeply could we cut the Pentagon budget and do it in a progressive way, as you point out, not to hurt people's salaries and the benefits that people who are serving now, and certainly when you think about veterans, for example, people who have served already, and there's some obligation to keep either their pensions or certainly their health care intact. What would you do?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question because I mean, again, as even the proponents of this amendment are saying, 10% is a modest beginning to start reinvesting in real priorities. So there's actually another resolution that was introduced in the past week or two by Representative Barbara Lee, who's also co-signing this 10% cut for a cut of almost half, of $350 billion. 10% is something like $74 billion. So she's proposing 350 billion, and that's been co-signed by a bunch of other progressives, including some of the newer, more recent ones like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Ilhan Omar, and that doesn't have as much support because it's seen as much more of a flex goal. Right now, 10% is, I think, the benchmark they're really trying to consolidate in the next year. But the $350 billion number comes from a bunch of sources, but the National Priorities Project, where I work, published a report last year with the Poor People's Campaign called the Moral Budget that introduced an itemization of how we could cut $350 billion safely by targeting a lot of the things that this amendment is targeting, but also expanding that to include actually ending the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, bringing the troops home, really going after military contractors in a much bigger way, closing overseas military bases. Right now, the US has over 800 foreign military bases all over the world. To put that in context, the next largest country has about 20. That's 780 more foreign bases than any other country has. And that's very expensive. And there's just extremely little accountability about what those bases are even doing, how they're spending that money. And in a lot of places, they're very unpopular. So cutting those bases by 60%, which would still leave us with 300 overseas military bases, which is way more than any other country has. That's a pretty reasonable place to start. That could get us, I think, about $100 billion in cuts. So I think this 10% cut is a really modest place to start. It makes a lot of sense just because there are very easy ways you could do that, just probably by tackling bloat, like literally like accounting better than they have been, because it's really worth emphasizing that the Pentagon is the only agency in the federal government that has failed an audit. It hadn't been audited at all in decades, and it actually just finally was in the past 2 years, and it failed. Like they could not make the numbers add up. So holding it accountable to some kind of accounting process would probably cut a lot of money right off the bat. So those are a bunch of things, and then there are other things like cutting unnecessary weapon systems, many of which can run up to 10 or 15 billion dollars or more. There are submarines, attack submarines that cost $12 billion or more, aircraft carriers that add up to about $10 billion, Navy destroyers that are $8 billion. So there are all these things. And then there are more recent projects that have passed under the Trump administration, like Space Force, which can give a clear explanation of what that even is going to be, why it's necessary.
Right. That's a pretty wacky idea. But anyway, thank you very much for being on the program, and keep up your great advocacy for returning us to a sane policy around defense, and keep on pushing for those much deeper cuts. And thanks for being on the show.
All right. Thank you so much.
And that'll do it for this week's episode. I want to thank my guests, Debbie Berkowitz and Ashik Siddique. Our editor, as usual, is David Hebden. Our major sponsor is the American Postal Workers Union. You can support us actually in two ways. One is you can spread the word everywhere about this network. You can do that by sending the link to this episode, and you can support us financially. You can do that in two ways, as I said before. You can go over to our website at workinglife.org, look for the podcast tab, and then find your way over to Patreon, and you can make a contribution there, either a one-time contribution or become a regular sponsor. Or if you're more comfortable, you can use ActBlue. We've partnered with ActBlue to raise funds to support this network. We really would appreciate you becoming one of our supporters, our small donors. Thanks for being with us. Look forward to having you back next week.